Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so excited that so many of you could join us today for On the New Normal of Narcissism. I'm Jason MacArthur, the events coordinator for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Ramani Durvasula and Elizabeth Markle, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Dr. Ramani Durvasula is a licensed clinical psychologist in Los Angeles and professor of psychology at California State University, where she was named Outstanding Professor in 2012. She takes on our modern scourges of entitlement and incivility in Don't You Know Who I Am? How to Stay Sane in the Era of Narcissism, Entitlement, and Incivility. She is the author of the Modern Relationship Survival Manual, Should I Stay or Should I Go? Surviving a Relationship with a Narcissist. The focus of Dr. Durvasula's clinical, academic, and consultative work is the etiology and impact of narcissism and high conflict, entitled, and antagonistic personality styles on human relationships, mental health, and societal expectations. Dr. Elizabeth Markle is a licensed psychologist, professor, and assistant professor of community mental health at California Institute of Integral Studies. She is also founder and executive director of Open Source Wellness, a clinical community integration initiative offering experiential behavioral health and wellness to individuals and families. Dedicated to multi-theoretical and multi-level approaches to individual and community health and healing, Elizabeth's research and entrepreneurship are focused on systems design to generate social support, social capital, and social sustainability in health and healthcare. And now, let me turn it over to Elizabeth and Ramani.
Hi, Ramani. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's my absolute pleasure, Elizabeth. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Well, I had so much fun reading your book, which ironically matches your shirt perfectly.
It does, yes. I favor red these days. Yeah. So yes, thank you.
Yeah. Well, there's so many things that I can't wait to hear from you about, but I thought I would start by just asking you how you got into this field of study. What inspired you to dive so deep into the world of narcissism?
You know, I tumbled into it in many ways, and I was, basically a student had approached me who was working at one of our clinical research sites and was commenting on how some of the patients coming into the clinic were sort of demanding all the attention of everyone there. And I'd never thought of it. And I thought, this is interesting. These kinds of high conflict personalities probably put a real drain on healthcare systems. And that gave that tiny seed went on to about 10 years of grants from the National Institutes of Health, looking at personality disorders and health. But at the same time, in my private practice, I was also hearing people coming in with stories, mostly about intimate relationships, but also about family relationships, where the same themes kept coming up over and over again: invalidation and manipulation and lots of confusion. And I find myself they would be so overwhelmed that I would be taking my notes and they say, could you drop some of that into a quick email to me? And I would, I would just send it to them. I'm writing the same email over and over again. That slowly became, should I stay or should I go? And then we had an election in 2016. And then this word that I was sort of quietly working with in a backwater of academia was now everyone was talking about it. And then I got angry. And I think the anger is really what put me into this full on, because what I was seeing is this wasn't just husbands and wives and husbands and husbands and wives arguing with each other. This was about the loss of human potential. This was about lifetimes of people feeling silenced because they had been so minimized and trivialized and dismissed. This was cutting across cultures. And that was sort of where I almost had it. And so I thought, people need to understand this. It's not being taught in grad school. Therapists didn't understand it. Nobody knew where to turn. There was sort of this strange kind of underground of narcissism information. And that's when I went all in. So ultimately, what really propelled me over the wall was anger, as it does with many things in life. So that's what happened. Yes.
Well, fair enough. And this is a timely conversation then, as our collective global anger actually rises. But before we go there, let's get on the same page about what you mean by narcissism. Are we talking clinical? Are we talking personality disorder? Are we talking traits of behavior? Help us all orient together.
Narcissism is a pattern. That's the best way I can put it. And a lot of people really take umbrage at this word. It feels very clinical to them. And if you take a riff on sort of the work of Dr. Alan Francis, who's really written brilliantly about mental health, and especially he actually was one of the architects of the diagnosis of our narcissistic personality disorder. He's like, we really have to be very careful on how we medicalize things. And in this case, the word narcissism is risky because here we start to medicalize meanness, we medicalize spitefulness and vindictiveness. But the word is simply a pattern that refers to things like lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, a person who chronically seeks out validation and admiration, a sense of arrogance, control, a person who cannot cope with frustration or disappointment. And when faced with those situations, they tend to lash out at other people. There's a lot of rage. There's a sensitivity to criticism. There's a real hypocrisy. I can say things to you, you can't say things to me. I can break the rules, but you have to follow the rules. But all of this, which a lot of people can sometimes misread as tremendous confidence or bravado, is a shell around a very insecure core. And that insecure core is incredibly vulnerable. And the more vulnerable that core feels, the more antagonistic the narcissist becomes. And I even tell people, like, if you don't like the word narcissist, I run into that a lot with clinicians, as I'd imagine you'd understand that a lot, because we're like, I don't want to diagnose someone I haven't met. And I'll even use acronyms. I'll say, like, okay, let's use the word caved. Let's try that. Conflictual, antagonistic, vulnerable, entitled, and dysregulated. So I'm always trying to figure out the workaround. I've talked about it in terms of being difficult, being toxic. It all kind of ends up at the same destination, which is a pattern that is not only good for the person who possesses it, it's definitely not good for the people who are exposed to it. And yet it is something, and I don't know what your experience was, Elizabeth, but in graduate school, I don't think I heard the word narcissism once. I didn't get any formal training in personality disorders. It was only when I was in supervision that maybe a supervisor would talk about it, but it wasn't talked about. And that to me is already an oversight in the field.
It has certainly gone out of vogue, right? When we want to look at manualized 12-session therapies, narcissism is not something we know how to even meaningfully speak about. And, I hear your concern about stigmatizing or being unkind, but I also hear the power of naming a pattern, naming something that is present and actually impacting people all day long, every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that where I've gotten frustrated, and just to almost give some historical context to this, I'm sure you've heard of this, is this idea of the Goldwater rule. This was something that had come out from the American Psychiatric Association as almost like an ethical stance, that one should never diagnose a person that they have not evaluated. Now, first of all, narcissism as a term is not a diagnosis. It would be if you and I were sitting together at a table and we saw someone else on the other side of the table who was worried. We say, golly, that person seems anxious. We wouldn't call that diagnosing them, So to me, narcissistic is an adjective like that. But when the Goldwater rule came along, everyone got very, very fussy about ever using any kind of a clinical term, least of all one that's stigmatized, like narcissism. So when 2016 happened, and the conversation turned to what is happening, what is going on, what is this person's behavior? Some people were peddling out that word, and then all of a sudden it turned into this big discussion of the Goldwater rule, and we shouldn't diagnose people we haven't met. And the reason I really got frustrated by that was a lot of people were very confused about what they were witnessing day in and day out on the news and on Twitter and all of that. By giving people a framework, they could at least understand what they were seeing. And that's really my only goal. By giving people a framework, at a minimum, I can tell them, this is what you're going to expect. This is how it's going to go down. And for many people, they're saying, I feel in so much more control of this toxic relationship now that I know what's coming. Ironically, exactly the same things are coming that were always coming, but now they know they're coming. It's very, very different. It's like finally turning on a weather forecast. You're like, this rain thing can be predicted. And so it was very similar that people are saying, oh, thank you for giving me this kind of a roadmap. And that's really what it becomes with any of these sort of high conflict personality styles. You can sort of predict how it's going to go. And I think that has tremendous importance for workplace issues, for family issues, for couples issues, and just for people to generally go through the world.
Makes sense. Well, while we're clearing up common myths and misperceptions, you started to speak to the difference between healthy self-esteem and narcissism, and that narcissism is not typically what it appears. Can you say just a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So a lot of people have viewed narcissism as this inflated self-esteem. It's actually not. And even in fact, when you look at the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, sort of diagnostic Bible, which I don't even like calling it that, sort of what we've been given to diagnose with, is that the DSM-5 refers to narcissism as variable and vulnerable self-esteem. There's a big difference. This is not self-esteem that's overly inflated. It is inaccurate. It is distorted. It is misperceived. It is vulnerable, and it's variable. Healthy self-esteem is observed in a person who has a strong sense of self, who knows who they are across situations, that they can sort of not feel a sense of threat by every interpersonal interaction that doesn't go their way. There's a big difference. There's a stability to healthy self-esteem. There's an incredible instability in the self-esteem we observe in narcissism.
Thank you. Yeah, makes a lot of sense and is so resonant with what any clinician has observed, I think, when admitted to the inner world of someone whose behavior aligns with narcissism. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And I do also think, Elizabeth, is that many times at first blush, a person's first pass with a narcissist is very grandiose and larger than life. And they tend to hold court, and everyone at the party is listening to them, and their stories are better than anyone else's. It's very easy to sort of get lost in that vortex and wonder, why is that person making so much noise? Why do they feel the need to hold court? I think we are so immediately oriented to that person who has so much charm and charisma that we assume that they're doing it right, rather than wondering what might they be compensating for. It's a paradigm shift.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk more about that. If this is truly toxic, then why don't we immediately recognize it as toxic, just the way you'd recognize a toxic environment or a chemical that you'd say, I want nothing to do with that? How is it that we are so seduced and so taken in by this pattern?
The cynic in me would say that the people who make the rules and run the media have really put out this image of the narcissist as this great thing to win over. I do think that we are taught at a relatively early age that charm and charisma and confidence are all great things, that these are wonderful things to look for. And in fact, we are a very extrovert biased culture. We think extroverts are healthier. And in fact, many people will, in fact, I have a graduate student working on this right now on her thesis, and we're sort of frustrated because her and I are both introverts, and having this moment where the extroverts come out better on almost all the mental health indicators. And but I had to explain to her, I said, listen, the extroverts are treated better by society, and so we are very biased to the person who's the life of the party. And we assume that the person who's the wallflower or sort of sticking to the corner, that they're somehow lacking. And I do think that we are now, especially in the last 20 years, Elizabeth, I think this has sort of spread like an accelerant on a fire with social media and other things like reality television, where we really do sort of celebrate shamelessness and attention seeking and all of that. But these patterns have been here for a long time. And when we take away from the sort of the grandiose piece of it, narcissism is also very much about domination and control. And so these people were natural leaders. Well, the natural leader also had most of the food, most of the property, was probably the one functioning better, even in a tribe or a village. So I think that this has always been the case, that to the degree that there's a human alpha, they're probably a narcissist. And that's who we're taught to value, follow, lead, or may simply have had more than us. And so I think that this is a story that's been sold to us. So it does go back to this issue of, why don't we teach this? And I think that it feels uncomfortable because, again, it is such a massive paradigm shift. And I don't think people understand it. I think we are very much, and I hope it's something we end up talking about, we're very much there's a culture, and I think a world of where we talk about the benefit of the doubt and giving people second chances and always forgiving without exception. And I think what that does is it paints people into a corner where they say, this pattern's making me uncomfortable. And someone else will weigh in and say, maybe you need to give them the benefit of the doubt. And people are easily talked out of their sort of instinctual feel of, this does not feel comfortable. People who are narcissistic read the room better than many other people because they have to. They need the validation of the people in the room simply to survive. It may matter less to the rest of us, so reading the room becomes less important. But by reading the room, they know how to work their way through the room. And I think that we really do need to learn, though, that a person who lacks empathy and is entitled and is grandiose and is not self-reflective, this is not healthy, and that we have to get out of the sort of benefit of the doubt mindset.
It's such a paradox because even with this insight, we can tell that someone whose behavior is narcissistic is not actually having a great time, right? They may in the moment, but they are suffering profoundly on the inside.
Precisely.
And yet, compassion and endless forgiveness and benefit of the doubt is not necessarily the road to health for anybody involved.
Well, and there to wit is the challenge, right? Because it is literally like walking on a razor's edge. And the hardest thing for me has been to talk about this pattern as toxic, but in the same breath, to tell people, please also be compassionate. I'd love to illustrate this by a story that literally has happened to me in the last 12 hours, because it really affected me profoundly in a way I didn't think it would. Last night, we found out that the president got coronavirus, okay? My politics would probably be very clear to anyone knowing that I study narcissism, and I'm not particularly fond of what the Trump presidency has created for our country. And when I found out, it was 10 o'clock last night, that he had gotten the virus, I was gleeful. I was happy. And for a moment, I even put out a mean-spirited tweet. I quickly took it back, but I was happy. I was gleeful that another human being got sick. I went to sleep, I woke up, and I felt absolutely awful. And the reason I felt awful was I still don't like his presidency. I still wouldn't vote for him. But in fact, he is a human being. And what has happened to me that I have sunk to that level of incivility and participated in an interchange that I don't think is right, that I think is contributing to a larger problem. And I think that what has happened, and the reason I wrote Don't You Know Who I Am, is that we have gotten to a point where this sort of toxic human interchange has become so modal and so normalized that without thinking, we are very quickly sliding into it. And when I really took some time this morning to think about it, I thought the lesson for me there is I remain sort of indifferent to him. You know, I actually I'm not going to monitor his health status. That's his business. But the desire to sort of get caught up in that made me reflect on things like how unjust I feel things are right now, how unheard and how helpless I feel things are right now, and how that led me to want to lash out. And if that's happening to me, I know it's happening to many, many other people. So how could I step back? And that the compassionate stance here was to not say anything. Yes, Schadenfreude, that sort of pleasure we might get out of a person's misery, is very human. I don't think the Germans would have come up with a word for it if it wasn't a human thing. But I didn't like what I'd become. People would say, oh, come on, he deserved it. That's a slippery slope. So my attitude would be, though, let's bring him down to just being an ordinary citizen who's just sort of this really kind of mean-spirited, vindictive kind of a person. I would say you need to set a boundary and get distance from this because it's not healthy for you to spend time with it. So rather than make fun of him for being sick. And I realized how much I felt the injustice and the helplessness had pushed me into this toxic space. And I had to take responsibility for that. It's not right for me, to say something. It doesn't model a healthy behavior for my kids. It doesn't model a healthy behavior for the world. And so that moment of incivility taught me how far we've fallen, is that we're all doing this right now. And I can sense that we're all sort of on the edge of our seat. So it's how can we all also take individual responsibility? But that means, how do you have compassion for somebody who's hurting you, but also give yourself permission to distance yourself from the relationship? That cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is this idea, as you well know, Elizabeth, that the mind cannot maintain opposing thoughts simultaneously. So we craft justifications to make it all fit. The classical tale of that is sour grapes, right? So we're kind of living in a sour grapes world right now. We're trying to make the pieces fit. In this one, they're not going to fit. You can compassionately let someone go because they're hurting you.
Wow, you said so much there. First, I just hear the the contagiousness
Yes,
of
it
this,
is.
the normalizing and the outrage fatigue, and then the enactment that we all get caught into. And I hear, again, another impossible paradox of when someone beloved and dear to us is hurting us or is displaying these traits, we can feel compassion for them and the wish that it would be different, and still need to set boundaries, to get distance, to protect ourselves, rather than waiting for imagining something that will change.
That's exactly right. And I think that many people interact with narcissists, they interact with them as the person they wish they were, rather than the person they are. And then what happens is the person they wish they were doesn't exist. So they keep getting frustrated that what's coming back at them is so hurtful. And so that's where I say, this is what you're dealing with. And so I really talk a lot about a concept called radical acceptance. This is it. And I am sorry for whatever backstory they have that got them to this place. It is not your responsibility to fix them or change them, and to let go of that responsibility, but to do so with grace and not from a place of vindictiveness, because then it's like, what is the old adage goes, it's like swallowing poison and hoping that the other person dies. It's not worth it for you. But again, it goes back to that word I was using, Elizabeth, which is justice. People feel that these relationships are inherently unjust, and the human brain doesn't do well with injustice. It was wired for justice. It was wired for sort of things, kind of being balanced. We don't do well with hypocrisy. We don't do well with justice. In fact, that's a lot of Jonathan Haidt's work is on that. And it's really fascinating because that's not what this brain does well. So when we're faced with multiple injustices, systemic injustices, injustices all the way from the top, levels of the government, all the way into our day-to-day lives in our homes, we start to snap. And so people want justice. And so they'll often stick it in stay in these relationships and want that justice delivered. To which I say, you're wasting a lot of life. The best justice here is that you set the boundaries, or you get out of the relationship and then proceed to live a healthier life. That's the justice. But people often want something bad to happen to the narcissist, that it won't feel right until that happens. And that's the piece that I try to help people let go of.
In your book, you speak about dealing with a narcissistic partner, but also those folks that we didn't choose, a parent, a child, a family member, where setting boundaries is heartbreaking and very, very challenging at times, a co-parent.
Absolutely. It is a bit, you have to understand, it's also very intergenerational. And sort of the tragic legacy of having a narcissistic parent or parents is that it really, really does leave the person honestly either committed to a lifetime of anxiety, of feeling that they're not enough, of feeling that they can't even regulate themselves well. So there may often be struggles with alcohol or drugs or food, or just feeling they were never given that because they really weren't seen. The narcissistic parent makes it about themselves. In fact, even when the child goes to the parent and says, "Mommy, I feel sad," the mommy's response might be, "Well, now I feel sad." And you're like, "Oh, no. And so the child learns that their emotional world is not only not valued, but it is that the parent is the only one who gets to corner that market, which can really lead to then what? A sort of a repetition of those cycles in adulthood, and choosing partners that re-perpetuate those cycles. And then yet another generation of children may come from that, growing up with at least one narcissistic parent, and the beat sort of goes on. And so these are legacy issues that really stick with people. And that's also the heartbreak, because you almost want to get to people before they choose their partner, right? This is why I always think this would be such a key issue to teach about in high schools, that teenagers really need to understand this. The entire sort of rom-com Disney princess, kind of hegemony that has been pushed on, especially women, of looking for the prince, waiting to be rescued. These are really, really actually dangerous stories to tell. And they really do become almost internalized sorts of mythologies that can also nascently push people to choose partners that are actually either narcissistic or domineering or controlling, or Beauty and the Beast is my favorite, where, hey, let's find a rageful person who's going to control me and isolate me from the world. And then I'm going to dance around with him and he's going to come around because of my love. Just that one story, that mythology of I will rescue someone with my love, I don't even want to think about how many lives have been destroyed over that myth.
Right. You know, you speak so clearly about confidence, charisma, and charm as things that are pink flags, magenta flags, things that we ought to really be paying attention to, that they sometimes coexist with humility, kindness, all kinds of other things, but not always.
I would say not often. And so I would say when you meet someone charming and charismatic, don't just run away, but spend the time peering behind the curtain. Look at their capacity for empathy, for closeness, for reciprocity. Are they capable of doing the dance of conversation? How do they regulate themselves when there might be a moment of disappointment or stress or interruption? Listen, I've heard thousands of stories and worked with hundreds of clients on these issues. And without exception, in the intimate relationship space, most people said in the first month I knew something was off. And these are people who've been married for 40 years. I mean, these are not like new dating relationships. They'll say in the first month I knew, however, I was 30, no one else was around. I didn't think I deserved better, or I thought this was normal, and all the justifications you hear. But in many cases, it was that after that first sort of charismatic spark, the rest of it became very clear. And I think that it's really, instead of getting dazzled by the charisma and the charm, it's about hunting for the intimacy and the empathy. And that's not what we teach people to look for.
It's not. Well, I'm so excited to hear later about your recommendations about education and how we would inoculate a cohort, right? A generation against narcissism, both in expressing it themselves and in falling prey to it in another way.
Right.
But I want to go back. You mentioned emotion regulation.
Yes.
Like something happens and then how do people handle themselves? Can you say a little bit more about how emotion regulation is related to this whole phenomenon?
So people with narcissistic personality styles or these more difficult personality styles, emotional dysregulation, trouble managing their emotions, is one of the sort of leading characteristics we see. So a very, very quick amping up into rage, blaming and lashing out at other people when there's a point of disappointment, when something goes wrong, very quick to say this is everybody else's fault, and getting angry at everybody else. So this dysregulation is also associated with impulsivity. There's a lot of acting out, doing things without thinking, in essence. And because of that, many times people with narcissistic personalities can hold a lot of power because people start walking on eggshells. They're so terrified of upsetting this person that they end up enabling them. And that regulation issue is actually considered to be most likely a sort of a social and developmental issue, that they say, they being I, the royal they, that, and you know this as a psychologist, that much of the work of parenting is fostering empathy, regulation, self-soothing, and emotional vocabularies in our child. Multiplication will figure itself out, okay? But that stuff, you get one crack at bat at that one. And so that idea of teaching the child to self-soothe, to experience disappointment, even if it's something as little as playing a board game with a child, they lose. The child wants to throw a tantrum, and the parent then walking them through that landscape. Many, many times adults who become narcissistic in childhood, those regulatory issues were already starting to come out, whether it was impulsive rage, acting out at siblings. We see it. And you'll see that sometimes in a family system, there will be multiple children. Only one is narcissistic and the others are well put together. And they will often have a recollection, even as children, the sibling that went on to grow into the narcissistic adult was not as well regulated, would act out a little bit more often, did have more sort of unsettling anger. And then, so that implies that there might be a temperamental style associated with this too, a sort of an underlying temperament that may be more fragile, that may be more sensitive. But all of that said, this really does come down to not being given that opportunity to learn to self-soothe in childhood, which then turns into an inability to self-soothe in adulthood. So whereas the 1-year-old can get a pacifier, 40-year-olds can't really get pacifiers, but they sort of do. It might be drugs, it might be alcohol, it might be spending money. And then when the pacifier falls out of their mouth, they start screaming and yelling and throwing adult tantrums, which we see quite often in our world of grown people, grown adults, throwing tantrums.
Wow. So yes, what I think I'm understanding is that when someone who displays this pattern has difficulty self-soothing or self-regulating, rather than calling on internal resources to do that and continuing to be kind, they regulate using other people. So by making other people insecure, we would call this projective identification if we were in the dynamics class, but they actually create in others the experience that they are having. And in such, it's a consumptive way of engaging with other humans.
You said it so eloquently. It's exactly what it is. And in fact, a lot of Freud's early work on projective identification did actually tie into sort of talking about these personality styles, frankly. So the idea of projective identification, creating the chaos in the world that they're experiencing within, is sort of a signature move of narcissism, which is actually a way we could derive some compassion for them, not enable them, not embolden them, but actually have some compassion, saying, do you see this chaos this person is creating? They are a mess inside. This is like they're throwing up on us. Okay. So this ickiness is inside of them. But I do not want you to sit here and put up with it. See, it's the but that is the issue. So a lot of times, like, they're suffering, they're struggling, and they put a period at the end of that sentence. That period is not going to, this is a compound sentence. And so you really have to go on further and say, and you know what? They're not 3. They're 43. And if they can't figure out, you're not going to teach them how to regulate. They are an adult. They can go get the help, the therapy, whatever it is they need to get this under wraps. But a lot of people feel like, well, they had a tough start in life. Well, they, their dad abandoned the family, or mom abandoned the family, or it was traumatic. I said, I get all of that, and my heart aches for that person. And that does not qualify you to be their punching bag. And it's not your job to, again, it's like an outsourcing of emotional regulation is really what it is. For the rest of us, the entire system is internalized. I always say it's like a building with a scaffold. That's what a narcissist is. All of their regulatory abilities are all sort of outside the building. They're supposed to be inside the building. And that's why we always see them. And some of that regulation happens through grandiosity and entitlement. I'm so great. Look how great I am. I'm the greatest. That's regulation. Because if they keep saying they're great, then they are.
And that external regulation is fine for a therapist who gets paid for their time to help you regulate to do. It's not fine as a demand on the people around them.
That's exactly right. And yet those are the people who bear the brunt of it. And so, and listen, the literature is very clear. Narcissistic individuals or people with narcissistic styles or even full-on narcissistic personality disorder are almost 60% more likely to drop out of therapy. So just when you turn up the heat on a client with this personality style is exactly when they're going to stop coming.
Right. Because it's ego syntonic, right? If they're not experiencing it as a problem, if other people are experiencing the problem, the motivation to really work on this is probably intermittent at best.
Yeah, it's intermittent. And I know what I've seen, because I would estimate probably a third of my clinical practice has been narcissistic clients. I mean, it's the only way you're going to learn it is to sort of actually be present with it. And what you'll see is that typically what has brought them into therapy was a relationship failure, a workplace issue, or something sort of problematic like a lawsuit or something that would actually cause public shame. Those are the 3 primary reasons narcissistic individuals will come into therapy, that it is a regulatory issue. And in many ways, they've often burned all the bridges they've had. They talk to every friend and everyone, and nobody wants to hear it anymore, or they're given an ultimatum. A partner will say, you either get therapy or I'm out of here.
Got it. You're bringing to mind a little tiny story that I want to share. This happened so recently. A dear friend and I were speaking about a third individual, and I found myself saying to my friend, "Oh, you got to pick your battles with him. Don't bother bringing this up. Don't go there." I was really coaching her to hold back, and she took my advice. And then a few days later, she called me and said, "Liz, I've thought about this, and while pick your battles may be good advice, it's also a sign that that person has made it so unpleasant to be challenged, right? Has made it so punishingly difficult to raise anything with them. This is not a healthy system." And she said, in a healthy system, you raise things and it gets resolved or it doesn't, but it's not a trauma for anybody involved and nobody is terrified of it.
That's exactly, and you nailed it. Right there is, when I wrote the book, Should I Stay or Should I Go? It would have been very easy to write a book that was called Go. I mean, But the fact is, about 50% of people stay in these relationships, and their reasons are incredibly valid. Culture, money, children, fear, age. I mean, all myriad reasons. And as far as I'm concerned, no one's reason to stay was judgeable, that this is what they felt was right. They also didn't understand what they were dealing with. So when I put together that section of the book, what I said to them was, to stay in this relationship, you can't really share anything. You can't share good news because they will minimize it and trivialize it. You can't share bad news because they'll either mock or humiliate you or minimize it again. So you're really only stuck with the weather. Can you bring in the mail? Did they change the trash day because it's a 4-day week? Like, that's it. You cannot be vulnerable. You have to be, you're being very careful. Like you said, it's choose your battles, to the point that it's no longer an authentic relationship. And people say, well, this isn't an authentic relationship anymore. I said, exactly. It never was. You were never able to be yourself because you were so fearful of their reactions. And that's often a wake-up call for people who say, okay, I'm out. But they almost needed to see that now it's working. There were no more the bouts of rage and all of that, but there was nothing there. They weren't speaking about anything. There was no more relationship left. And if anything, when they stopped giving the narcissist the fight, the bait or anything, the narcissistic partner would get very angry at them. So because it was almost like, well, we used to be able to fight, and this is where I got I would kind of basically get my energy out, and you're not even giving me that. And so for many people, it was a wake-up call, but not for all. And some people interestingly said, now I figured this out. And I've seen different relationships take different paths with this very sort of neutral, sort of nothing stance, because they didn't want to split up homes or, assets, or they had issues with children, whatever the reasons were. But that's it. There isn't a lot of there. And to me, that is a lot of enabling. But what's interesting, I frame it differently. If you know what you're dealing with and it's very intentional, then it may not be enabling as much as I am not going to put myself in the line of fire anymore now that I understand how this works. But many people become very sad because there are 3 things that keep a narcissistic relationship together: hope, fear, actually 4: hope, fear, guilt, and lack of information. So hope that it's going to get better, fear of being alone or the uncertainty of the future, guilt, actually, that if I leave this narcissist, they are not going to be able to take care of themselves. And then finally, lack of information, because people don't understand these patterns really are not amenable to change. So the idea of I'm going to stay here and I'm going to try it this way and I'm going to try it that way, and I'm going to shift strategies over and over to see if the narcissistic person will change, they're not going to. So then it really comes down to radical acceptance that if I stay in this is it. This is what it is. And some people go on, Elizabeth, and they end up focusing on their careers. They focus on their friendships. When they're not with very controlling narcissistic partners, they almost kind of carve out a life for themselves. I hate to say it, more than a few have gone on to have extramarital affairs, saying, at least I want to feel touched and connected to again. And, and I completely understood why that was. So, they just felt like it was the first time I had felt connected to a human being in 25 years. So people find their workarounds, and that's very personal.
Wow. Thank you. I want to go back to something you said earlier when you were talking about how narcissism emerges in a family. And you used the words domination and control, which perk up my ears around gender. Correct. And how boys and girls are socialized differently. And I wonder if you could speak to how that whole thing happens.
So I think that, the issue around gender and narcissism is actually a really sort of interesting, a bit of a third rail. I think, and I made the error often to say, well, this is a very male pattern. But then when I break down how many people have come into therapy and said they had narcissistic mothers, I'm like, well, clearly there's a critical mass of women who are narcissistic if this many people have this toxic sort of difficult mothers. That said, you're absolutely right about the socialization process. It is more prevalent in men. There's no 2 ways about it. And part of that is socialization. Part of it is how we shame emotion in the development of boys. We teach them that emotion is weak, that it is ridiculous. They are often humiliated for it, or worse, if they attempt to share emotion. That is rendered on the play yard with their male peers. That is sometimes reinforced by teachers. It is certainly reinforced by parents. We don't cultivate emotional development and emotional vocabularies in boys the same way we do in girls. We do not give permission to it. Then we also foster that sense of domination, which is partly done by society, where we do still put forth a very authoritarian, a very patriarchal kind of a model, which that's sort of delivered as a given. So that's definitely going to play to the gender hierarchies, the idea that men need to dominate and control. If they don't, they're not doing it right. Even that what we see about classroom behavior, how teachers engage male students compared to female students, even in the earliest grades. So it is a socialization that comes up, and up. It's continued as late as grad school. I mean, I'm sure you've been in professional meetings where you see that play out, and domination, control, and male hierarchies. I'm thinking, how is it I'm in a room full of psychologists? And I'm almost looking around like, anyone else seeing this? It's everywhere. And so I do think, though, that where we do men and boys such a disservice is by shaming emotion, shaming vulnerability, because I think right there you say, what would the curriculum look like? It would be that. But the problem is, Elizabeth, is the schools could do it. You got to get the families on board. You can only do so much at school and then throw them back. And can you imagine that child is sent back into a household where all of that emotional training is then degraded by mother or father? I mean, it could be either gendered parent that could humiliate them for that. So this is a much bigger societal conversation. I think the schools are a place to begin. But if you don't get that buy-in at home, if anything, that child, especially a male child, could learn to be contemptuous of emotion, delivery of emotion, and vulnerability. And that's sort of where we are right now, is still that sort of sense of male strength being viewed as contempt for emotion.
It puts youth in such a bind where they have emotions, right? They're not going to stop having emotions, but then they have contempt for their emotions,
correct,
which requires a convoluting and inverting and then an externalizing of that emotion in ways that are socially acceptable, but absolutely toxic.
100% toxic. And it is that right there is so much of the conversation. And with each passing year, the other thing that would be part of such a curriculum, because if the core of this is insecurity, really the answer is to stop rendering insecure people. How do we create a world full of people who feel comfortable in their own skin? To me, that actually starts going into a very interesting sociological angle. Secure people don't buy stuff. Like, I'd be fine with this one shirt. I'd wash it every so maybe I have a second shirt and I'm good to go. I don't need 25 shirts. I wouldn't fall for the insecurity of, I want what they have, I need what they have. And so those kinds of, again, this is not just about let's play chutes and ladders and then I'll deal with you losing. This is a much bigger conversation about how we, how do we raise secure people and how do we maintain them as secure adults? I'm a college professor at California State University of Los Angeles, and it comes up all the time with the students who say, social media is destroying us. We know we shouldn't be doing this, and yet we compare ourselves to others and look at the lives of others and always assume that what they're doing is better. Somebody always has more. All of this fosters this sense of insecurity, which is where the lashing out comes from. But when that comes from early childhood and then just gets reinforced all the way into adulthood, that's where you really run into a mess. And what better way to protect against that insecurity? Just walk around saying you're the king or queen of the hill.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Part of what I hear you saying here is that secure people are not profitable.
Oh, they're not at all. No.
Right. Right.
No.
And that there are powerful interests tied up in people being insecure and
Absolutely.
being in a consumeristic pattern to try to maintain a fragile sense of okayness.
Keep people insecure and you'll be able to control them. And, I know that's a very cynical thing to say, but it's very honest. And it's if we were to even view it through a lens of a cult, an organization that might coax people in, keep them under the control of a very strong leader, the commonality amongst those members is a desire to belong and often a sense of insecurity that then is replaced by somebody who they identify with telling them, no, you're fantastic, right? So that becomes the tool, and then it becomes a tool of control. But secure people don't consume as much. Secure people just sort of quietly and authentically go through the world. Secure people probably aren't that much on social media. They may look at it to get a recipe for an apple pie, but they're certainly not getting into the weeds with it. And so it is the answer. I mean, if there was one answer, if somebody said you had a magic wand, you could do one thing, I'd say, I'd want to make everyone in the world feel more secure. If people felt more secure, there would be no reason for one person to have $150 billion, while most of the rest of the people have next to nothing. There would be no need for that, because you'd say, oh, I got more than enough. So how's about we start spreading this out to everyone? You know, that it's that sense, power, dominance, and control, which is reinforced by these societal systems. To me, these systems are narcissistic. They lack empathy, they're entitled, they're grandiose, they're arrogant, they're validation seeking. That's a system doing that. So we're all in relationships with narcissists. People might be walking around, my mom and dad are great, my partner's great, my friends are great. No, you're in a relationship with a narcissist, and it's called the world at large.
Well, I love that we can have this conversation, that we are not just assessing or diagnosing an individual the way the DSM kind of draws little lines around the individual, but opening our conversation to communities, systems, entire societies. And, you know, the phenomenon of gaslighting has gained recognition in recent years, thankfully. But what I start to think about is marginalized groups who have been gaslit collectively for hundreds of years.
It's so interesting to me that the word gaslight has such an interesting history. I'm sure many may know this, but if not, there was a play that came out in the 1930s, and then that got followed up with films in 1940, 1944. The 1944 film was the American film, starring Charles Boyer and Ingrid Bergman. And if you haven't seen it, you gotta see it, because I cannot believe in 1944 such a prescient film was put out there. But when you really look at the film Gaslight, it's not just somebody who's fooling around with the lights. Gaslighting is a grooming process. And the grooming process is predicated that the gaslighter either has expertise or authority or trust. And with that power, it's not just about confusing their victim. It's about gaining their consent. So as though they're signing on to this process and then completely are under the control of the gaslighter. And you're absolutely right then. Does that not describe what societies do? We know what's better for you. We got you, because that's every colonized culture in the world. We know what's better for you. You're backwards. Let us come in and fix it. That's gaslighting. All colonization was on the basis of gaslighting. And yet we didn't have the word until recently. I don't know what people called it prior to the 1930s, to be honest with you. I've always wondered, because honestly, the word narcissism wasn't used in the world of people in mental health until 1910, when Otto Rank used it for the first time. Up till then, it was a myth about the young man who was cursed to have to stare at his reflection. And so, but it is very much a societal phenomenon, and it is how you can keep control and maintain marginalization and marginalized groups by gaslighting them. When you're gaslit, Elizabeth, you're confused. And when you're confused, you're inefficient, you're off balance, you're full of self-doubt, and you're constantly trying to make up ground, like maybe this is me, and maybe I am the one who's losing my mind, and I don't even know where to turn anymore. And then you isolate. The only antidote to gaslighting is to hold on to your reality for dear life and say, it's an interesting version of events, but I'm good over here. Like, I got me, if only, Ingrid Bergman had said, no, I know I put my necklace in the bag. I know it, and, but we're all taught to have that sense of self-doubt. Like, well, no, maybe you are the one who's wrong. Think about how many times that we say, how many times we even ask people the question, are you sure? That's like a mini gaslight. They said they're not hungry. They're not hungry. Not, are you sure? They're not hungry. So we do it. We do micro gaslights all day long without even thinking about it. But these macro gaslights aren't just person to person. They're society to person. And they are a way to ensure that a marginalized or an oppressed group cannot climb over the wall. And when we are seeing really painful reckonings on race, as we have this year, It is an attempt to push past that gaslight, and look at the amount of pushback there's been.
I mean, it's messaging baked into the fabric of our country, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, equal opportunity, all men are created equal. That's the messaging. And no wonder people feel crazy. Like, that is not my experience.
Exactly. Exactly. And so it does, it slowly, it destroys a person from the inside out. And so it's very interesting, because I'm going to sort of be a bit of a gaslight spoiler here, but what ends up saving Ingrid Bergman's character is that one other human being bears witness. One other person steps in and says, I think something funky is going on here. And this is where, for all of us, need to remember, when we see someone who is gaslighted, whether it's at a meeting, whether it's a friend of ours, do not stay silent. Go up to them and say, I just saw that happen. Are you okay? Because the person will say, that was real, and say, yeah, it was. If enough of us did that for each other, you have no idea how much healing would take place. I can say this as a woman of color, is that I have been in meetings, and one of the most profound anti-gaslighting experiences I had was relatively recent. And I was on a Zoom call with multiple people, and something had happened that was really not right. And I let it go. I thought, well, maybe I misread the situation. I gaslighted myself. It's very clever, right? And that night, I got an email from a woman, from an African-American woman in the group. And she said, I am so hurt. I'm in so much pain after watching what you had gone through. And I have to tell you, I just cried and cried when I read the email, because I didn't feel crazy. I feel I'll always have this little debt to her, because in a moment where I was going to go to bed convinced I was wrong, and I felt so deflated, I felt I had let this group down, she said, what was done to you was so wrong. The profundity of that email. We all have the capacity to pay attention and ungaslight the people around us.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think we have all been there, been rescued in a sense by someone who had the courage to speak up, whether it was about race, about power, about gender, about something teeny but noticeable.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And then to check in and say, I saw that. Maybe that's all you do. You don't have to do anything more. You can't fix it, but you can say, I saw it. And that, again, that was, to me, that was the clincher in the film too. Somebody said, I saw it. And then you see what happens to her character once she feels that, I'm being seen. And when we see this in the relational space, for example, in the domestic violence space, gaslighting it's a universal. It's in 100% of domestic violence cases, you'll see gaslighting. That entire campaign of isolation that the perpetrator will place on the victim in the domestic violence situation means that the gaslighting can go on without anyone addressing it. And this also elevates to another interesting issue around culture, because another phenomenon that I've talked about is I call it gaslighting by tribe. It's when multiple people gaslight you. So this can happen in a family system. So let's say there's a narcissistic mother or father who is mistreating someone in the family system. And she's the person who's being gaslighted saying, can you believe she said that? And everyone's saying, no, stop making such a big deal about it. It's not that big a deal. Like, let it go. She only wants what's good for you. So now multiple people are doing this. The family is closing ranks, and because it may be that family loyalty sort of is more important than having someone bear witness in that family. And in the most tragic cases, and I'm sure you know a lot about this, Elizabeth, is when there are cases of abuse within a family, when there's sexual abuse happening in a family, how many times that is gaslighted by a family. And we know that the children who have the best outcomes after they've had that violation of trust are the children who had somebody who was willing to bear witness. This is the antidote. And as long as we're being gaslighted by a country, we need someone to say, this is not okay. This is what is being done to you. And it means you have to be comfortable with your own reality. And back to the idea of a curriculum, that's what needs to happen for kids. Your reality is valid, not Johnny didn't mean it, or Mary, don't, give Mary another chance, or give Joey the benefit of the doubt. It's not, we have to teach kids like that's not okay. In fact, I remember even when I had small children saying to them, you are never to teach your class, you should never to treat your classmates with disrespect ever, but you never have to feel compelled that you have to play with someone. I wanted them to know that they could feel that they could set a boundary and not be forced into some sort of amicable, playful encounter that they have to enjoy. I said, it's okay to say, I'm going to keep playing my game by myself, but it's never okay to disrespect. That's this. I was trying to teach them even at that young age, how to walk the razor's edge.
I love this. Okay, so let's imagine that our country wakes up tomorrow with renewed conscience and insight and says, Ramani, the trillions of dollars that are buried in millionaires' pockets is now going to you, and your task, your invitation is to inoculate our society against this pandemic, shall we say, whether it's educating young children, changing social media, changing the culture of executive leadership. What are some of the things that you would put in place?
Number one, above all else, I would ensure safe spaces for children and protect children from trauma. I think that it is that the traumatic exposures that children go through that not only put them at risk for choosing harmful relationships in adulthood, that it also engenders people who issue harm and have these kinds of high conflict personality styles. I would then say in schools, like at this point, they got calculators. Like, can we just go with the adding and the subtracting and maybe the long division? Like, we're good. But can we build in structured curricula from preschool on, and all the way through high school? Drop the AP classes, teach them empathy, teach them compassion, teach them emotional regulation, but not in a stigmatized way. What we do now with a dysregulated kid is we label them, we punish them, we humiliate them, instead of really working on ways where we do frustrate them and then help them come back off that frustration, like you do in your work, your very experiential kind of work. I mean, I think that that's actually the most profound, powerful form of doing any kind of therapeutic intervention, is do it in the moment. Don't talk about it like it's happening, but do it, like feel it and then talk about it. But we need much more innovative curricula around really doing emotional regulation. We need to bring the parents. Schools cannot be siloed anymore. It cannot be you go to school and then you go home. We have to make parents partners in the schools. We know that, honestly, since time immemorial, and this really hit a really rough patch during the Nixon presidency, where he really held back a lot of money that was starting to go towards more sort of social development programs, saying those are issues of the family. It's always been sort of a conservative stance on family issues need to stay in the family, which is code for we don't want to spend money on these programs. And so that idea of creating family school partnerships, making these community almost like it's an extension of the home and vice versa, and the home is an extension of the educational space, that we have to sort of break down some of those walls and see the schools as the profound social spaces that they can really be. I think we've got to teach kids very young how they're being manipulated by media. I once taught a graduate class on media psych, and I was teaching my students, like by the end of the semester, it was like how many 10,000 ways they had been manipulated by Facebook and advertisers. And a lot of them said, they're like, I feel like I've just come out of the fog. I fell for all of it. And I said, of course you did. Nobody taught you, like at a very young age. But there's such a fear of, we don't want to turn our kids into cynics. I'm a big fan of turning our kids into cynics, a really big fan, because I still think they'll be able to see the joy in a butterfly. And then I think we need to make mental health as regular as pediatrician exams. They should be with a developmental psychologist or child psychologist. We should be getting physicals. The way people get physicals, they should be in a therapist's office at least once a year. Therapy should be much more readily available. It should not be a luxury product. I think if we have that, there might be more of a likelihood to be able to talk about feeling and talk about these issues together. I think we have to revamp how we talk about leadership. I think that we have to start pushing into leadership the people who literally don't want to be in leadership because they don't want the headache of leadership. Because I think there's good research showing that people who are more narcissistic actually are the ones who tend to push for leadership. So there's a lot of work to need. But if I had to put it all in one place, it would be to protect children from trauma.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Well, we have a few minutes before we're going to transition to Q&A. I am having a moment of compassion for anybody out there who's listening, who's going, oh my God, I've been a jerk. I've lashed out. I've had moments where I, didn't disclose the whole truth of what was going on for me. What would you say to someone who's out there thinking, oh man, am I a narcissist?
Moments aren't my concern. Persistence and pervasiveness are. Okay, so patterns are persistent. They're there more often than not. We all have moments. We have all yelled at somebody in Starbucks because we didn't get enough sleep. The right thing to do is go back and say, I am so sorry. I should not have taken that out on you. We have the capacity to do that. We can, whenever we're not graceful, we can then go back and walk in grace. It's always possible. And so I think that what we're looking for are people who are contemptuous of sort of other human beings, who view other human beings as conveniences, as in an instrumental utilitarian way. And how we manage ourselves after the fallout of our moments. We're all going to have moments, but how do you talk about the moment afterward? How do you approach someone? Are you willing to take responsibility for it? Are you willing to take ownership and say that I was out of line? I am so profoundly sorry. And whether you don't even have to accept that apology. I am sorry I did that to you. And that's that. It's ownership. So I think that probably most of the people watching this aren't narcissistic. They would have gotten bored in the 5th minute. So, but I get that question a lot. What if I am the narcissist? And I break it down for them and they'll say, no, I've probably got too much empathy. But we're also in a culture that is so interesting. And back to your, the points you had raised about gender and oppression and marginalized groups is that I'm amazed at how many people where when all they do is take care of themselves a little, they think they're being selfish. And that's part of a socialization process of that idea of like, it's okay to take care of you. But a lot of people, particularly women, have often gotten that message that there's something somehow selfish if you are, at one point saying, this evening I'm going to do something for myself. And sadly, if they do have a difficult person in their life, they'll often jump on that and say, you're being awfully selfish doing what you need for yourself. So I do think that there's people out there who, oh my gosh, today I actually decided to just put my kids in front of the TV and have a glass of wine while I read a book. I'm like, you rock on, sister. Good for you. You need to do that from time to time. Versus I feel like I'm a narcissist. And no. Occasionally caring for yourself is not narcissistic. It's necessary.
Well, I'm appreciating your grace and your humanity as you speak about all this. And I wonder if there's anything else that I didn't ask about or that we haven't touched on yet that you want to name before we kick over to some questions.
As I said, that I think that there's a term I use in my book, I call it tend to your own garden, which is this idea that many people want to fix other people's messes. Like, I don't like that. I say, you know what? Like I said, I did not conduct myself well when I heard that the person who is currently the president of the United States got sick. I could have just said, I just need to be indifferent to this and not speak negatively about it. We can all find 100 small ways a day that we can be more civil. Let someone go ahead of us in a line. Let someone go ahead of us in a line of cars. Say, please, thank you, and ask a cashier how their day was. Take an extra minute in a email to check in on how someone's feeling or how you're doing, instead of like, yeah, sure, yeah, done. And, we're all guilty of it in this very, very quick, pressured culture. And so I just want to tell people, tend to your own garden, find 5 ways each day that you could have been more civil or empathic or kind, because the odds are then that somebody may end up paying that forward. And like I said, the final piece to, if I had $1 trillion, is how could I help everyone become more secure? Is how can you foster that security in other people? Listen to them, care about them, be interested in them. It is amazed how many people out there don't feel seen or heard. And so if we could see and hear each other more, I honestly think that you could even be with someone who has different views than you and still be able to hold space for each other.
Thank you. I love that. It's not rocket science. It's not fancy gold standard psychotherapy. So we've got a question from Alexander who says, we know that social media like Instagram reproduces narcissism and popularizes it. How can we identify a narcissistic personality on social media? And is it possible to understand that this is narcissism, or this is only a presentation of the personality as a brand?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
It's often hard to tell on social media if someone is just, constantly maybe posting pictures of oneself, I don't know, in various states of undress, or, in a way that they're trying to, maybe doing really foolish stunts that seems to get them validation. That is a validation seeking behavior that I'm amazed at how many people are teaching me and schooling me on that this is their job. Like, these followers translate into real money for them. Now, do I think that there is a very well put together, sane person who is getting in all those followers and likes, and then is walking through life as a very quiet, sort of quiet, not narcissistic person? I mean, I think that the validation seeking element of social media is so sort of baked in, but it's not for everybody. Think of how many people out there that don't use it in that way. But I actually think, to Alexander's question, where you might be able to see a little bit about more about the narcissism on social media is how they conduct themselves in comments. Are they contemptuous? Are they cruel? Are they, minimizing, even gaslighting, but saying harsh things to someone, putting out comments that are unkind, that are meant to get a rise? Because if you call them out there, like, I didn't mean that, I was just, I just want the attention, red flag, that you would do something that could potentially be hurtful to somebody just to get attention. To me, that would be an indicator of sort of a narcissistic pattern. I do think, though, what social media has done is created this sort of false self, which is actually sort of a core conflict in narcissism too. They have this false self that they portray to the world, whereas the genuine self is actually quite fractured and insecure. And the false self is just that. So people who have proximity to that person, they'll say there's an absolute disconnect here. And I have to say, one of the struggles I have is that anyone who's posting to social media in a way that is designed to say, look how much better my life is than yours. In fact, a psychiatrist I work with, she said it brilliantly. She said, social media is a tool designed to induce envy. And so that envy induction, if somebody feels that that's a meaningful way to spend a life, I would have to wonder what would be the driver, that this idea that I want to show people my life is better than theirs. If they say, well, I'm doing it just to make a buck, I'd still say that is, to me, that would be a somewhat problematic motivation. Listen, I'm not the judge and jury. And I would say with anyone, you actually can't tell if someone's narcissistic on social media. You'd actually have to meet them in person to really, really try to fully understand them. There's people out there who are saying, listen, this false self I put out there, it's sort of like a storefront. If you really want to know who I am, meet me someday, and then you can make the decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of what I am hearing in that is that social media is not necessarily a space where vulnerability is celebrated, welcomed, esteemed, and that spaces like that in our culture are precious and need to be cultivated, where our humanity, our vulnerability, our not knowing, our lack of confidence, our shame even can be held and welcomed.
That's not social media. And I have to say, for me, what I see as a mental health practitioner is people who will take vulnerable experiences, vulnerable experiences into social media. And without exception, they are met with critical, demeaning, rude comments, which for some people can really, really be triggering for them in myriad ways. So this is where I'm saying, as part of curricula, it's really teaching people how to use social media. We do need to create safe online spaces where people can share, because I have to say there are some closed social media groups that have done some really amazing stuff. They have moderators. There are people watching to make sure that the discourse is safe. And there are people out there who say, you know what, even though I'm isolated, there is this place where I can share, but that does require a lot of gatekeeping. And I think that this, the cruelty that gets played out there, and I have to say, if I were to hypothesize here, and this is me spitballing, I don't have the data. No, there was actually a study that came out supporting what I said, came out this week, that that people who post this kind of in this cruelty and this trolling stuff on social media are quite often what we call covert narcissists. They're sort of resentful, sullen, broodingly angry people who feel that the world never gave them the recognition they deserve. So they hide in anonymous internet spaces and they lash out at other people.
Got it. Wow, part of what we do at Open Source Wellness is just work really, really hard to very intentionally design communities where belonging, hope, validation, support, accountability, all of those things are baked in. We're not just hoping they will happen that way. We are modeling it, pushing it, reinforcing it. to not just slide towards a consumerist and frankly profit-driven kind of culture, but very, very intentionally create something different.
That's right. And it does have to be intentional, but as you know, it's work. I mean, it's work. It's not, these groups will not watch themselves. These are people, when people are fragile, you need someone there to help them be safe and to make sure that no one comes in that can do more harm. And I think that that's where online spaces, they do require a lot of gatekeeping. I think there's incredible possibilities there, but there is also a lot of gatekeeping. And I hate being the messenger on all the darkness that's out there, but there's a lot of darkness out there. Someone's got to be the messenger. But I do have to say to people, like, I think that we still do have a sunny view of what all people will do. They'll do the right thing. They'll do the kind thing, maybe not so much. And I think that we do, again, that's why I think preparing people about what these personality styles are and the harm that they could do to you, you do not need to push them away cruelly, but you do need to be guarded against them.
Thank you. Well, I have another question here for you. This is from Allie, who says, can people recover from narcissistic personality disorder and change who they are? What does treatment for people with narcissism look like, and how successful is it?
It's a great question, Allie. So what we know is that, first of all, I want to clarify one thing. She brings up narcissistic personality disorder. Okay. So this is where you take all these various patterns I've talked about, but in addition, the person with those patterns either has to be sort of uncomfortable with those patterns or be saying that they're having a lot of impairment in their life about it. And because a lot of people don't think that they're having problems because of it, the rates of narcissistic personality that have been cited in literature sit somewhere around 3 to 6%, not very high at all. And I don't even know that those numbers are accurate because it's hard to do large scale studies on this particular personality style. There are studies out there of therapies that people attempt with narcissistic personality disorder. I've read about 15 different models of therapy, ranging from different cognitive behavioral therapies to these various metacognitive therapies, interpersonal therapies, schema-focused therapies, a lot of literature out there. And I got to tell you, I was left pretty cold by it. A lot of it is case-based literature. We've had one client who came to therapy every week for 18 months with a highly trained therapist, and then we saw change. I don't know about you, Elizabeth, but I don't know many people in the United States of America who can afford to see a skilled therapist once or twice a week for 18 months. So I suppose there's a possibility, but at a population level, at the level of all people with this, because of the high dropout rates, because of the high burnout in therapists, because of the lack of insight, because of the tendency to blame other people, and the fact that therapy takes such a long time, that in general, this is not a pattern that's particularly amenable to change. I've seen people make shifts. I've worked with many clients who've done the 18 months, as it were, but they themselves have even said, you know what? I'm actually not interested in being like sunshiny person. I'm going to get a divorce and I'm not going to date anymore, but I can't do this. I don't care about people's feelings. Like, I'm not interested. So if that's what it means, I don't want to hurt anyone. And I've had people say, after working with you, I realize how many people I've hurt. And I don't want to do that anymore, but I can't be bothered with all this empathy stuff. Like, it is too much for me. I'd rather just pay someone from time to time and have sex, but I can't. And they literally said that in as many words. So the short answer to Allie's question is that if you have an incredibly motivated, insightful client who's well-resourced enough to find a really good therapist who knows how to do this work, maybe.
Telling it like it is.
Most conditional answer I've ever given.
Well, I got another big question for you here. This is from Beatrice, who says, do you think narcissism is the root of racism or any other form of discrimination?
Narcissism is highly correlated with all isms, with racism, with sexism, with heterosexism, with ableism, ageism, pickenism, and narcissism is associated with it. But think about that. The core of narcissism is insecurity, right? And so anyone who's different, the other, would be a threat to that. And especially for a person who holds privilege, to want to hold that sort of false power that privilege gives, that could push a lot of these isms. But the research has actually shown associations between racism, for example, and narcissism. They do tend to go together because what is the core of racism or any ism? It's a lack of empathy. And so, yeah, they're highly, highly associated. And it would be actually kind of rare to find an ismistic person who was not heavily weighed down in more than a few narcissistic traits. There's an entitlement. I mean, to be racist is to be entitled. I'm better than you simply on the basis of my race or my social class or my gender or whatever. I'm better than you. I deserve more than you. That's entitlement. That's a core pillar of narcissism. So yes, Beatrice, my answer to that would be yes.
I love it. All right, I'm going to keep going here. This is a question from Ryan, who says, how has Western consumption, single-use plastic, upgrade culture aligned with technology like social media and dating apps influenced narcissistic behaviors in romantic relationships?
Absolutely. I love what Ryan's done. I tried to do this in the book. Actually, Ryan did it in a question. Please, Ryan, read my books. I have a whole section on this. First of all, I think that so much of what we've done to our planet is narcissistic. We showed no empathy. We were deeply entitled, as though we were the only occupants of this hotel. And we sucked all of our validation through sucking fossil fuels out of it. We related to this planet as narcissists. And now we're trying to go and do that in other planets too, the gall. But I really mean it. Like, we abused our home as a narcissist would. And I think we all can view our complicity in that. Now, skip to the idea of the culture of convenience. The idea of anything, any person, any system being convenient is also driven by a narcissistic mindset. I deserve, I need, I want, rather than being mindfully present and saying, okay, how do I work towards this? That sort of quickness that technology has offered plays to this too. And now what it's culminated in is a quickness in how we get sort of the pleasure from human coupling. Now even the human, the human mating and uniting rituals that we have been turned into something very commodified. Mm-hmm. And I think that online dating, the heavy use of pornography is sort of like diminishing the intimacy from sexual relationships. Again, what we've seen is a bleed out of intimacy. And so I think all of these things that Ryan's talking about, which are very dismissive, very focused on speed, and very focused on not even attending to one of the most important relationships we have, which is with the planet that we live on. If we can't manage that, then of course we're going to drag all the empathy and the intimacy out of human relationships. And we could end up commodifying that process. By no means is everyone doing this. I mean, but I do think even our construct of human relationships has changed. We're probably going to see young people get married at some of the lowest rates that they ever have. I think that the idea of close relationships has changed. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing, but I think there's a functionality that has shifted. But one of the core deficits, two of the core deficits in narcissism are empathy deficits and intimacy deficits. Close relationships are considered to exist solely to regulate by and to get quick silver needs met by, like sexual needs, other pleasure needs, needs for validation, needs to look good. I'm going to choose a young partner or a wealthy partner or a very attractive partner to boost my sense of self-esteem. So I think all of these things coalesce together. And I do think that a back to basics on sort of human courtship is absolutely essential. And when I say human courtship, I mean, it's a wrong word. The human relationships of how can we be present in our close relationships? How can we choose off that checklist mentality, which has so driven how people have been making partner choices in the last, last many, many years of they need to have this job and they need to be this way, that I think that as we cheapen so many other human experiences, we run the risk of cheapening how we relate to other human beings, including, and I'd say especially in intimate relationships. So the short answer to Ryan is yes. So that's it.
Whoa. I'm going to ask a question of my own here. I kind of have my heart in my mouth about this, about the parallel, saying that all of us as a civilization have engaged in a narcissistic and abusive relationship with our planet.
Yeah, we had narcissistically abused the earth. We have.
Right. And then you talk about the success rates of treatment and of individuals saying, you know what, I don't have it in me. I'm not interested. I would say I see that in all of us and in myself in moments of, you know what, I want this coffee because I need it and I deserve it. And I know it comes in a paper cup, but this is what my life requires right now. In a way, I feel the entitlement in all of that, in our saying, I know the planet can't deal with this, but I'm going to drive because I want to drive. So how do we come back from that edge, or can we?
I think that again, it goes back to that tending your own garden. I mean, obviously there are some people who live in extraordinary ways in terms of limiting their carbon footprints and the waste they generate. And I admire them, and I see the shortcuts I take. But then how can we find other ways to make sure we are very mindful of recycling, be aware of the products that we buy, figure out how we can do this. It's awareness, that awareness, and to the degree we're paying attention, that one of the greatest antidotes to sort of this shift towards toxic human interaction that we have in everybody these days is mindfulness. And to Ryan's point of how quick we've become about everything, quick and mindful don't go together. You've got to slow down. And the slowing down is where you stop and say, maybe I don't need the coffee, or I can go and find my reusable water bottle, or let me think twice before I buy this. We know during the pandemic, the plastic consumption has shot way up because people are buying all this food that they can take away, as well as, then trying to mobilize people to do the research to figure out, are there better ways we can package things? Because we also have to be realists, right? It's like, as I'm saying with all of this is not going to go away, and people aren't going to divorce their mothers. So there's got to be workarounds here. And so, but I think that it's even just the mindful slowing down gives us that moment when we think about, what could I do differently? Even if it's one thing. Imagine if 7 billion people did one thing differently today. Just whatever it is. And I don't mean that to be sort of a kumbaya kind of a message. I do mean that as a mindful awareness of, what can I do in each day to address this? Because I think then that bleeds over ultimately into the relational space that Ryan was sort of bringing that up to, rather than this sort of commodified, very quick kind of a relational space that does suck the intimacy out. And I think as one thing goes, so goes everything else, right? So once we have these sorts of devalued, close, intimate relationships, we start devaluing other things. It's how do we bring value into what are such core human values, like compassion, kindness, respect, empathy, the value of other human beings. And, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend, though, because as much as of a doomsayer I am being, Robert Sapolsky, who's actually at Stanford, who is, to me, one of the most profound thinkers and writers of our time, in his book, Behave, he does a phenomenal job of laying out the fact that actually human beings are nicer to each other now than they've really ever been in human history. We're actually kind of a mean species. And so he's like, we have evolved quite a way. So as much as, these are tough times, we used to brutalize each other. So there is this evolution. And in fact, if you read Freud and Civilization and its Discontents, you see also that we are evolving. But I do think that we've hit this tipping point where we have now incentivized these kinds of toxic attention-seeking patterns, because in a world of so much income insecurity and lack of sufficient health care, and it's terrifying to grow old, the idea of hoarding all the resources to make sure that you and your family, you and your tribe are safe, I get it. We need to take better responsibility for each other. If people know that they're going to grow old and they'll be okay, we will be able to take care of you. It'll be okay. I do think that we probably see less of this hoarding. Sometimes when I'm thinking like, oh, I got to make more money at that, it's not to buy a fancy car. It's to make sure that I might be able to not only help take care of my parents, but my nephew and my other family, my children and myself. It's actually nothing more sinister than that. But I think that's the place many American families find themselves, which creates a sense of selfishness and egocentricity for survival reasons. And that Sapolsky would say that very egocentricity led us to cut each other's heads off on a regular basis. Maybe we're not doing that anymore, but I do think that we're doing that at sort of a more technologically savvy level, is sort of beheading each other.
Amen. I appreciate you really naming the impossibility of the prescription to be more secure in a world that does not take care of each other. It reminds me of doctors saying, you need to reduce your stress, or, you need to take care of yourself better. Good luck with that now. Off you
great.
go.
Okay. Homie, you need to move in my house, clean my house, do my laundry. I got a whole list of stuff you can do, doctor. And once you do that, I am sure my stress will be good. But I worry.
Totally.
thing is though, Elizabeth, a lot of us also worry. I do worry when I see how many residentially unstable people there are living on the streets. That's like, that stays with us. And as much as people say, wow, that's their fault, and whatever cruel, dismissive kinds of rhetoric is out there, we worry. And when we worry, that's a source of stress that's already built in the minute we walk out the door.
And then would make sense that somebody who is charismatic and confident and seem to have it all together is so appealing.
Right.
They seem to think it's all going to be okay. They're going to make it okay for us. And we are vulnerable.
We're very vulnerable. And the ultimate antidote to anxiety is reassurance, even if it's a false reassurance.
Got it. Okay, that's a dark moment right there. Well,
I'm full of them. Let me tell you, no one's having me over for Thanksgiving dinner. I'm telling you that right now.
Well, I'm gonna share a very pragmatic question here from Gabby, who says, how do you take back a sense of power with a narcissist in your life?
It's a great question.
How do you even
Gabby.
talk about yourself when a narcissist doesn't engage in it?
Okay, so Gabby, one of the key pieces, and this is where it's multiple things you can do, is number one, you've got to hold your sense of reality and power within yourself. It doesn't have to be channeled to the narcissistic person in your life. So many of us get lost in the weeds of wanting the narcissist to understand our point of view. We feel the need to defend ourselves to them, to explain ourselves to them. I need you to understand. They don't care enough to do so. They're not interested in your point of view. So I think that to be able to sustain in such a relationship is really about giving yourself permission to engage in the realistic expectations. This person is not engaged with me, and that's not an indictment of me. I think all of us shrink to becoming a 5-year-old child when we're in the presence of a narcissist. And if we had that parent that ignored us or devalued us, or worse, shouted at us or dismissed us, when we're with someone who's inattentive, that 5-year-old in us wants to win them over and say, come here, look at the picture I drew. That's forever the conflict that so many people grew up with. So when we're with that narcissistic individual as an adult, that 5-year-old in us still wants to tug at their sleeve and say, look at the picture I drew. They're not interested in your picture, but your picture is absolutely beautiful. You just need to show it to someone who gets it. And you're not 5. You're not limited to the 2 parents in your house. As an adult, you have the agency and the power to go seek out those people who can see through to your authentic self and are actually interested in it. I always say that we have sort of a 90-10 paradox in our culture. We invest 90% of our psychological bandwidth in the most toxic, negating, invalidating people around us, and we only save 10% for the good folks who are going to be there for us no matter what, because they love us unconditionally. Flip the damn math. Put the 90% of that time and energy and bandwidth into the good folks who get you and see you and whom you see, and then just save the 10% to just sort of be kind of minimally engaged with the people who are willing to devalue you and negate you. Because I think it's just some of those little switches are enough. Again, you don't need to be dismissive and cruel. You just don't need to engage. And you need to stop showing your beautiful 5-year-old picture that you drew to the wrong people.
Well said. Thank you. This is similar. A number of audience members have asked something like, how do you deal with narcissistic colleagues in the workplace?
So this is a tough one, because for many people, it's their livelihood. So they could hold them back. I'm going to give some practical suggestions. Things like documenting become very, very important, because if this escalates to the point where you may lose an opportunity for advancement or worse, the only way you're going to get anything done in a workplace is by documenting things. And the documentation also serves a psychological function, because you could end up gaslighting yourself and saying, well, maybe I'm making too big a deal about this. You got to print out the emails. You got to save all the messages and all of those issues. But this also becomes an important wake-up call to not just assume everyone is hostile in the workplace. I'd like to think that, if it's a small employer, this may be harder, but seek out mentorship. And that mentorship may be outside of your organization, because sometimes people who are in your industry and somebody who gets it and maybe gets you, hopefully they get narcissism too, can maybe give you some guidance on how to survive this and what the workarounds are, but also create allies in the workplace. In fact, there was a really interesting article I had read in a journal where they were talking about how in toxic workplaces, what you sometimes see is that everyone is sort of banded around a universal struggle against this toxic person or persons. And through that collaboration, sometimes really neat stuff comes out. Like they sometimes go off and start their own venture, or they support each other, or they create the workaround together. But I think it's very much, first of all, the realistic expectations and the radical acceptance. Don't expect that one day they're going to wake up and be, little Miss Sunshine. It really could be a problem. But the other is to be aware of certain dynamics. One in particular we didn't talk about was triangulation, which I'm sure you're familiar with doing family work. Is triangulation is how a narcissistic individual creates chaos, and chaos leaves them in a position of power. And what they do is they split everyone up, and it creates a lot of infighting. So they become the only person everyone can communicate through. That's what happens in a family where mom or dad may sort of pit everyone against each other. This happens in workplaces. Well, one of the best ways to fight against triangulation is don't be triangulated. Actually go to the person whom you've been told all these mistruths about and talk to them. The narcissistic individual doesn't expect that people are going to do that. They're going to think that they're running a puppet show. So try to work around that triangulation by having the conversations in the workplace. But I'm going to be frank with you, Elizabeth, and I'm going to be a realist. There are some cases you may not survive the narcissist in a workplace. And many times good people go on to maybe start their own ventures or say, do I want to spend 25 years of a career dealing with having one foot always on my head or a glass ceiling created by toxic people? You really want to look at the institutional history of your workplace. You want to look at who's in the top levels of leadership. Are they mirroring this style? Because if that's the case, you're going to have a much harder fight than if maybe there's some solid people in upper leadership that you might be able to either converse with or see that there is some hope that someone will see this. But a narcissistic coworker plays this game far better than you do. I can promise you that now. So and at the worst of it, it might enter into litigation. You're just going to need a ton of documentation, but you have to be realistic. If you're starting to get sick, which we know workplace stress can cause illness, then you've got to potentially give yourself permission to exit from that situation and write it off as a life lesson. And a life lesson it is. It can be a very painful one.
Yeah, I would echo all that and just say from my experience that the energy drain, right?
Huge.
The huge amount of energy that goes into managing and processing and metabolizing and planning and getting other people. It's just, it may be good work and it may be more than anybody wants to do.
And one sort of little, silly manipulative nugget I'll leave you with is sort of this idea of, it's a phenomenon I call narcissistic fluffing. And what I mean by that is this idea that if you really just need to get the job done, fluffing can buy you about 6 months where, in a way, it's actually quite easy to play a narcissistic person. They're so desperate for validation that if you can really sell them on compliments and like, I feel so blessed to work with you. I watch how you've come up in this field, and just to learn from you is going to be a remarkable experience. Like, I don't think I'm ever going to get to your level, but I just want to watch you. And throw them a few of those like once a week, and you might be able to buy yourself 6 months, maybe enough time to get out and get another job. But I have taught people to fluff, and it has bought them enough time to either get the documentation they need or get themselves out of the position. You can throw them off you can throw them off the attack for a little while, and then get through a grant deadline or something else that needs to get done. You're going to feel sick at the end of the night. I'm going to warn you of that, but it just might be enough to sprint through to get yourself to the other side of something that needs to get done.
Well, then my last question here that I want to share with you, someone asks, what daily practices can we incorporate into our lives to recover after leaving a narcissistic partner or family? And I'm going to add colleague, workplace, community, etc.
Couple of things. If the relationship is done, okay, so you've come out of it, all right? I will often say there's a lot of problems with euphoric recall. People will often remember that, oh, maybe I made a mistake. And so I tell people to make what I call the ick list. I need you to write down every terrible thing that happened with this person. And the reason I ask people to do that is just when you feel like, well, maybe I should call them, or maybe I made a mistake. I need you to look at that list, because somehow all of the terrible things that happen in one place, you're like, oh, no. Because the euphoric recall sort of blinds our memory processes. That's one of them. The other one is what I call the crackers in bed exercise. And by that, I mean, like, once you get your own bed, you can actually, with something I do quite often is eat crackers in bed, just out of spite. My partner's out of the country now. I'm like, oh, I get to do this. But what I mean by that is, after having someone telling you, no, you can't do that. No, you can't watch that kind of movie. No, you can't have the light on. Do all the things you weren't able to do. Live in that, because I think so many people are saying, oh my gosh, what have I done? I've lost this relationship. Live in this sort of new life you can have, including eating the crackers in bed. And to that end, I also instruct people to make sort of a fantasy list. What are all the things you put on the back burner? Because this person said, no, we can't spend money on that. No, you can't do that. Is it a book you wanted to write? Did you want to go to it once this is all over? Did you want to travel to a certain part of the world? Did you want to take a class? Did you want to finish your degree? That whole fantasy list world just open up to you. We can also take a step out of, we can also take a page out of the 12 step, which is this idea of making amends. A lot of people lost a lot of people in their lives because they got stuck in their narcissistic relationship. They either burned bridges or they got isolated. Unisolate. Reach out to all those people you might have cut out of your life or were too busy or too traumatized to be in touch with, and slowly build up that part of your world again. And the other thing I tell people to do, because after you've been through the survivorship of a narcissistic relationship, you're often a bit more, you're more acutely aware of this sort of toxicity in the world. So I tell people to bookend their days. And what I mean by that is, I want everyone to have some sort of morning routine, and that's going to be very personal. It doesn't have to be fancy. It could be a candle you light on a bedstand and maybe some form of statuary you have. It could be mantras you say. It could be the kind of tea you drink in the morning. But I want it to feel ritualized, and I want you to breathe, and I want you to say, I am more than enough. I can manage the difficult people I'm going to see today. I've got this. I'm not going to engage. I'm not going to get in the mud with them. I can do this. I am going to be intentionally kind where I can. Like, you really prepare yourself for your day, and then you go through your day. Then the day is done. And if you've had any difficult interactions, you need a ritual on the back end, whether it's dusting off that candle again, whether it's a mantra, whether it's quotes you've got. But again, it's that idea of intentionality, that I am letting go of this day. And I teach people to do that if they have to continue dealing with difficult people or if they're recovering from it, because it feels like it can honestly be 60 seconds, but it's a moment you've created for yourself. And last bit I suggest, have some kind of ritual that might mean writing the most hurtful things you remember from that relationship, being told you're not enough, being told you're foolish, being told that you're too sensitive or your words don't matter. Write them on a piece of paper. If you're in California, don't burn them. Do something else with them. Write them on leaves and throw them in the ocean, but have some kind of letting go ceremony. Something where you say, I am not listening to this version of myself again. If you've got a fireplace in a safe part of the country, burn them. California, no water, but somehow let it go. And that is how, the more ritual matters to human beings. And in some ways, when you're sort of creating a new future and distancing yourself, it could be a nice way to let that go. And therapy, above all else, if you can find a therapist who gets narcissistic abuse, it's a really, really important healing space.
Wow, as you speak, I just hear the word reclaiming or reclamation.
Yes, exactly.
Of one's entire world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just so moved by your clarity, your courage, your verve, your willingness to imagine a new future, not only for many, many individuals, but actually for our society as a whole. Anything else you want to say before we invite Jason back to close us up for tonight?
No, I would say that especially as we go into the next very, very difficult month in our country and probably the next year or so in our world at large, this is actually a wake-up call to all of us to start flexing our muscles of respect, compassion, and civility. We've never needed it more than we need now. And instead of going into fight mode, this might be, sort of try to go into the other direction and say, how can I do better by my fellow human beings? And you'd be amazed at where that can get you. Instead of going to war, try to go to respect, go to compassion, and go to kindness. Give it a shot. Not with a narcissist. And don't tell them to put on their masks. Just avoid that. But the rest of it, you could do.
Amen. May we all be so graceful. Thank you so much for your time. And Jason, welcome back to us here.
Thank you so much for all attending today. We hope that you will join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded. If you'd like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available on our YouTube channel at the same link and on our Facebook page. We will also feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at www.ciispod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for joining us, and good night.